Hey, friends. We're working our butts off to bring you this content, just for your entertainment. If you like what you see, here's a deal: instead of offering us tea, just hit that subscribe button. It's way easier, totally free, and honestly makes us just as happy. Let's begin the new story for you. I woke up on an ordinary weekday with the kind of dull, familiar dread that usually comes from an alarm clock and an unfinished life. My eyes opened to the pale rectangle of morning on the wall, and for a few seconds I let myself pretend I was still asleep, still in the safe half-world where nothing has to make sense yet. Then I reached for my phone. The lock screen showed a face I recognized the way you recognize a stranger who keeps appearing in your dreams, close enough to disturb you, wrong enough to keep you staring. The name at the top wasn't mine. It wasn't even close. I thought it was a prank or a bug, the kind of glitch you can fix by restarting. I typed my passcode. It opened without complaint. Inside were messages with a familiar cadence, my friend's shorthand, my sister's dry humor, my boss's clipped punctuation. But they weren't written to me. They were written to someone else. To her. I scrolled faster. Photos. A birthday cake. A work badge. A group selfie in a bar where I had definitely been, except I couldn't find myself in the frame because I was the one holding the phone, smiling, hair longer than I'd ever worn it, wearing a blouse I would have sworn I'd never owned, standing like I belonged inside that shape. My first thought was that I was still dreaming. My second was more humiliating, that I was having some kind of breakdown, that the quiet fear I'd carried for years about my mind slipping had finally come to collect its debt. I swung my legs out of bed and stood up too quickly, and the room tilted. The dresser mirror caught me in the corner of my eye. I turned toward it because I needed to prove something to myself. The person in the mirror was still me, in the blunt sense of bone structure and eye color. But there were changes, subtle at first, like a haircut you can't quite place. My eyebrows were shaped more cleanly. My hair, which I'd worn in a practical shortcut since college, fell to my jaw with an intentional messiness. My face looked cared for. Not made up, not theatrical, not a costume. Just different, like someone had been taking responsibility for me in a way I hadn't. I leaned in and touched my cheek as if I could smudge reality with a fingertip. I tried to say my name out loud. It came out thin. The sound in the room was my voice, but my mouth felt unfamiliar making those syllables. Like I was speaking a language I'd grown out of. My wallet was on the bedside table. I grabbed it with shaking hands and flipped it open, expecting the one thing the world couldn't argue with, my ID. The card slid out smoothly, as if it had been used 1,000 times. A different name. A different gender marker. My face, yes, but in a photo where I was styled to match what I'd just seen in the mirror, the same longer hair, the same softened lines. The address was mine. The air in the room seemed to press down. I sat on the edge of the bed and felt my heart thudding in my throat. The simplest explanation, identity theft, should have been comforting. It wasn't. Identity theft doesn't change your friends' messages, your employer's records, your own photos. It doesn't make your own hands feel like they've been practicing someone else's handwriting. My laptop was open on the desk, left that way like I'd been working late. When I clicked it awake, the login name was hers. The browser opened to an email thread with my manager about a project I'd been leading. The manager's tone was the same. The project details were correct. The only difference was that I was being addressed with a different name, the kind of name people shorten naturally, the kind of name I could imagine being called across a room. And in that moment, something inside me did the strangest thing: it didn't just panic. It also listened. It listened to the part of me that, for years, had flinched every time someone said it'd be a man, like it was a moral instruction instead of a description. It listened to the part of me that had stood too long in clothing stores, pretending I was just waiting for someone, while my eyes kept drifting to fabrics and cuts that felt like they belonged to a person I hadn't allowed myself to be. It listened to the part of me that had tried on softness in private, no, not in secret, because secret implies thrill, and this was never thrill. It had been something closer to grief. The grief of knowing there were ways of being in the world that felt honest to me, and still believing I didn't have permission. That part of me didn't say, "This is good." It didn't say, "This is what you wanted." It just said, "You can't pretend you don't understand why this feels both terrifying and weirdly familiar." I stared at the screen until my eyes stung. Then I did what people do when their reality cracks. I tried to make it small enough to handle. I started checking facts. My calendar. Appointments. A dentist visit scheduled under her name. A reminder to call my mother, about her upcoming surgery. A note, bring her soup, the kind she likes. My bank account. Same balance I remembered, same rent payment, same grocery store charges. But the name on the account was hers. I opened social media with a nausea that felt like I might throw up. My profile was there, verified by my own face, my own memories. My friends' comments were affectionate and ordinary. One friend had tagged me in a photo from last month with the caption, "You look so happy lately." I felt something hot and shameful in my chest because part of me reacted to that caption as if it were a compliment I'd been starving for. The doorbell rang. I froze. The sound was normal. That was the worst part. The world was still insisting on being normal. I walked to the door like my legs didn't belong to me. When I opened it, my neighbor stood there holding a package, smiling the way she always did. She looked past me into the apartment for half a second, like she expected someone else to answer, then her smile widened. "Hey," she said, warm and casual. "I think this is yours." She read the name off the label. The new name. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look confused. She said it like she'd said it 100 times. I heard myself reply, "Thanks." My voice sounded steady. That steadiness felt like betrayal. As I took the package, my hand brushed hers. Nothing changed. No lightning bolt. No sudden reveal. She said, "See you later," and walked away. I closed the door and slid down against it until I was sitting on the floor. The package sat in my lap like a judgment. I didn't open it. I stared at the label, at the clean black letters that the entire world seemed to agree were mine. There are moments in life when you realize the story you've been telling yourself is not the only story available. The realization isn't always liberating. Sometimes it's an accusation. I thought back to childhood, to how early I learned that there were certain things I could be punished for without anyone ever saying the word punishment. My father wasn't cruel, not in the way movies make cruelty obvious. He was a man who believed in order, in rules you didn't have to explain because everyone just knew. My mother, gentler, still carried the same map of the world. They loved me. That was part of the problem. When people love you, you don't want to disappoint them, and disappointment can become a cage you build yourself. When I was 8, I found one of my mother's scarves in a drawer and wrapped it around my head like a veil. It wasn't sexual. It wasn't even particularly girly in my mind. It was just beautiful. It moved when I moved. It made the air feel softer. I looked in the mirror and felt a kind of calm I didn't have words for. My father walked in. He didn't yell. He didn't hit me. He just stared, long enough for my skin to go cold, and then he said, quietly, "Don't do that." That was it. 3 words. But the tone told me everything. This wasn't about a scarf. This was about which version of me was allowed to exist. I became very good at being allowed. I became very good at learning the rules before anyone had to tell me. I learned what jokes to laugh at. I learned how to stand, how to speak, how to shrug off things that hurt. I learned that masculinity was less an identity than a performance with consequences, and that the safest way to survive was to perform it convincingly enough that no one looked too closely. As I got older, the impulses didn't disappear. They changed shape. They turned into questions I didn't ask out loud. They turned into late-night internet searches where I'd close the laptop the moment I heard footsteps. They turned into a private ritual once every few months, standing in front of my closet, holding something soft against my chest, feeling both comforted and ashamed, as if comfort were evidence of wrongdoing. I didn't have the language then to separate identity exploration from stereotypes. I thought if I admitted I liked certain clothes, certain presentations, it would mean I was making a claim about myself I wasn't ready to make. I thought it would lock me into a box, the way my father's 3 words had locked me out of another. So I built a life that looked solid. School. Work. Friends. Relationships that started with hope and ended with the same quiet complaint, that I was hard to know. That I kept something behind my eyes. That I seemed present but not fully there. I told myself I was just private. I told myself everyone had secrets. I told myself the ache I felt sometimes, standing in a crowded room, watching women laugh with their heads tilted back, unafraid of their own softness, was just envy, or admiration, or nothing that needed a name. And now, sitting on my floor with a package addressed to someone else who was apparently me, I realized I'd spent years treating my own inner life as a threat that needed containment. I forced myself to stand up. I went to the bathroom and splashed water on my face. I stared into my eyes, looking for something to hold on to. Okay, I said out loud, as if speaking could anchor me. Okay. If this is real, I need to know how. I opened the package. Inside was a notebook and a small box. The notebook was plain, the kind you buy in bulk. My hands shook as I opened it. The first page had my handwriting. Not the version of my handwriting I thought I had, but a version I recognized in a deeper way, like the way you recognize your own laugh when you hear it recorded, uncomfortable because it's undeniably yours. There was a single line, written carefully, "If you're reading this, you're awake." My stomach dropped. I turned the page. "You're going to want to call someone. Don't. Not yet. Trust me. They'll sound like themselves. That's the trap." I sat on the edge of the bathtub. My throat felt tight. The next pages were dated, spanning weeks. Entries that described my days, my thoughts, my fears. A version of me, this version, had been living inside my life. Not like a stranger, but like a person who had been doing the work of living while I slept through it. Some entries were mundane, grocery lists, reminders, a note about a coworker's birthday. But threaded through them was an escalating awareness of something wrong. Mentions of gaps in memory. Of conversations that felt rehearsed. Of the sensation that my own reflection sometimes looked back with pity. Then, a paragraph that made my skin prickle. They didn't make me into someone else. They just made everyone agree on the parts of me I'd been afraid to claim. That's why it works. It's not a lie built from nothing. It's a rearrangement of truth. I read that line over and over. I wanted to reject it. I also couldn't stop feeling the quiet accuracy of it. At the back of the notebook was a name, a clinic, an address, a phone number. Underneath, they call it the archive. I stared at the page until the words blurred. My first impulse was to run. My second was to hide. But there was a third impulse, smaller and steadier, to understand. Because if someone had taken my past and rewritten it, they hadn't just stolen something from me. They'd also exposed something I'd been stealing from myself, the right to be complicated, the right to explore, the right to be more than one rigid definition. That morning I went to work because I didn't know what else to do. Routine can be a form of denial, but it can also be a lifeline. I dressed in clothes that were in my closet, clothes that fit the body I had, clothes that the world seemed to expect. Nothing about it felt like a costume. It felt like stepping into a life that had been prepared for me. On the train, people glanced at me the way they always do, briefly, politely, not at all. No one stared. No one pointed. My fear of being seen, of being judged, was louder than reality. At the office, my coworker waved and called me by the new name. I flinched, then forced myself to smile. He chatted about the weather, about a meeting, about an email I'd apparently sent him yesterday. I nodded, performing familiarity, and the strange thing was that my body knew how to do it. Like muscle memory. My manager stopped by my desk and asked if I was feeling better. I blinked. Better? I repeated, careful. She lowered her voice. You seemed really stressed last week. You took Friday off, remember? I didn't. But I didn't say that. I said,
Yeah.
I'm doing what I can. She gave me a look that was more human than professional. Good. And hey, if you need to adjust your workload while you're figuring things out, tell me. I'm serious. She walked away. I sat there, stunned, not by the offer but by the implication that this version of me had been honest about struggling. Honest enough that people noticed and cared. I realized how much of my life I'd spent trying to be easy. Trying to be low maintenance. Trying to need nothing. I'd thought that was strength. Sitting at my desk, feeling my palms sweat against the keyboard, I wondered if it had just been fear with better branding. At lunch I went outside and called my sister anyway, because my sister has always been my emergency contact with the universe. She answered on the second ring. Hey, she said. You okay? Her voice was familiar enough to make my eyes sting. I swallowed. Do you remember, growing up, did I ever? I couldn't finish. There was a pause. Not a shocked pause. A thoughtful one. You mean the clothes thing? She asked gently, like naming a fragile object.
Yeah.
Sometimes. Mostly when you thought no one was looking. I felt my face heat. Why didn't you ever say anything? I did, she said. Once. You went white and told me to forget it. So I did. Because you looked like you were drowning. I closed my eyes. The street noise blurred. I'm not crazy, I whispered, and I wasn't sure if I was asking or stating. No, she said immediately. You're not. You're you. And you've always been complicated. Which is not an insult, by the way. I almost laughed. It came out like a sob. Listen, she continued, I don't know what's going on, but if you're calling me like this, it means you're scared. So tell me what you need. I wanted to tell her everything. About the phone, the ID, the notebook. But the notebook had warned me. And something in me, the part that had read those entries and recognized the voice as my own, told me to be careful. I need time, I said. I need to figure something out. If I act weird, just be patient with me. I can do patient, she said. I can't do disappearing. Promise me you'll check in. I promise. When I hung up, my hands were shaking again, but my chest felt slightly less tight. The call had done one crucial thing, it had proven that the world hadn't completely invented this. There had been traces of me all along that I'd tried to erase. The terrifying part was that someone else could use those traces to rewrite my entire life. The clarifying part was that those traces were real. That night I went to the address in the notebook. It wasn't a clinic in the way I'd imagined. No bright sign. No comforting posters about wellness. It was an office building with a lobby that smelled like polished stone. The directory listed law firms, insurance agencies, consulting groups. Nothing called the archive. I rode the elevator up anyway, to the floor number written in the margin of the notebook. The hallway was quiet, carpeted, the kind of hallway that makes your footsteps sound like you're sneaking even when you aren't. At the end was a door with no name, just a keypad and a small camera. I stood there, feeling ridiculous, then pulled out my phone and typed the number from the notebook into the keypad, because I didn't have a better idea. The lock clicked. I pushed the door open. Inside was a reception area with a single desk and a woman sitting behind it. She looked up with the calmness of someone who expects you. Hi, she said, and then she used the new name without hesitation. We were wondering when you'd come. My mouth went dry. Who are you? Not who, she corrected gently. What? I'm a facilitator. We keep the process safe. What process? I asked, though I already knew in my bones that I wasn't here by accident. She studied me with an expression that was almost kind. You're in the reorientation window, she said. That means the overlay hasn't fully stabilized. You're experiencing dissonance. I clenched my hands. You changed my life. She didn't deny it. That was worse than denial. You were selected, she said. Not randomly. We don't do random. We do likelihood. Likelihood of what? She leaned forward slightly. Likelihood of adaptation. Likelihood of survival. Likelihood of becoming functional under a different narrative. I felt anger rise, hot and desperate. You don't get to decide that. I agree, she said, and her tone startled me because it sounded sincere. Ideally, no one would have to. Ideally, people would be allowed to explore identity without punishment. But we don't live in that world yet. So we study what happens when the punishment is removed. I stared at her, trying to fit her words into my understanding of morality. It didn't fit cleanly. You're experimenting on people, I said. We're measuring outcomes, she replied. There's a difference. Experiments are what you do to animals. Outcomes are what you do to policies. That's just language, I snapped. She nodded. Yes. Language is powerful. She stood and gestured toward a door behind her. Come in. You'll want to see your file. Every instinct screamed not to follow. But the truth is, I'd already followed. I walked through the door because the fear of not knowing was becoming unbearable. The room beyond was not full of machines. It was full of cabinets. File drawers. Shelves of binders. A wall of monitors showing what looked like social media feeds, public records, CCTV stills. It looked less like science fiction and more like bureaucracy, which made it feel more plausible and more horrifying. She led me to a table where a folder sat waiting. On the tab was the new name. Underneath, in smaller print, was my old name. Seeing it there, reduced to a footnote, made my stomach twist. I opened the folder. Inside were printouts of school records, medical forms, photos, transcripts. A timeline of my life, but with key moments annotated. Not just what happened, but what I felt, what I avoided, what I hid. It was like someone had been watching me from inside my own ribcage. There was a page labeled susceptibility markers. Under it, early suppression of gender expression, high compliance behavior, fear of social conflict, depressive episodes, perfectionism, strong desire for belonging, pattern of self-erasure in relationships. I felt sick. It wasn't that the notes were wrong. It was that someone else had used my pain as a dataset. What is this? I whispered. A profile, she said. A probability map. And the new identity? I asked, voice tight. Her. She didn't smile. Not her. You. A version of you with fewer restrictions. I slammed the folder shut. You don't get to do that to someone. She didn't argue. She let the silence sit between us until it became heavy. Then she said, tell me something. If you could go back, and you had grown up in a family and a community where trying on different forms of yourself wasn't punished, do you think you would still be the person you were yesterday morning? The question landed like a stone in water, ripples spreading through memories I'd kept controlled. I thought of the scarf. The way my father's voice had cut through me. The years of pretending. The exhaustion. The numbness I'd mistaken for maturity. I don't know, I said, and my voice broke. She nodded. That's the honest answer. That's why you're here. I felt tears in my eyes, not because I was convinced, but because I was exhausted by the war inside me. I wiped my face quickly, angry at myself for being vulnerable in front of her. What did you do? I demanded. How did you change everything? She tapped the folder. We didn't change you. We changed the record consensus. Most people's identity is held together by external confirmation, documents, photos, other people's memory, institutional language. Once you adjust enough points, the rest self-corrects. Self-corrects, I repeated bitterly. You mean people believe what they're given? People believe what helps them function, she said. It's not stupidity. It's survival. If the world insists you are someone, it becomes less costly to accept it than to fight it. I thought of my neighbor saying the new name without blinking. My manager's concern. My sister's gentle acknowledgement. The world wasn't cruelly forcing me into a spectacle. It was calmly handing me a life and asking me to live it. And my past? I asked. Is it gone? She hesitated. Not gone. Archived. The word made my skin crawl. Can I get it back? You can, she said. But it's not a refund. It's a choice. Reverting the consensus would destabilize relationships, employment, legal identity. People will feel lied to, even though they were the ones deceived. You'd be choosing a kind of social injury. So I'm trapped, I said. No, she replied. You're responsible. There's a difference. I stared at her, and something in me recognized the trap embedded in that framing. Responsibility can be a path to agency, but it can also be a leash. My whole life I'd been trained to take responsibility for other people's comfort. What do you want? I asked. She looked tired for the first time. I want this project to end. I want the funding to stop. I want the people who turned human lives into a policy experiment to face consequences. But I can't do that alone. And you can't do it by pretending nothing happened. The fluorescent lights hummed. The monitors flickered with ordinary lives. Mine among them. You're asking me to help you, I said. I'm asking you to decide who you are when you have evidence that identity can be manipulated, she said. Are you still you? And if you are, what do you do with that? I left the building with the folder copied onto a USB drive she'd handed me like a bad blessing. Outside, the night air felt too clean. Cars passed. People laughed on the sidewalk. The world didn't know it had been edited. On the train ride home, I kept thinking about how easy it would be to let this happen. To stop fighting. To accept the new name and the new presentation, to let the old self become a strange dream. There was relief in that thought, and I hated the relief because it felt like surrender to a violation. But there was another truth I couldn't ignore: my old self hadn't been entirely mine either. It had been shaped by fear, by social pressure, by my own avoidance. If I rushed to reclaim it just because it was familiar, I might be defending a prison simply because I'd decorated it. That week became a kind of internal trial. I began paying attention to how I moved through the world under the new consensus. I paid attention not to how others reacted, but to what happened inside me. Some things were easier. I felt less like I was performing toughness. Conversations felt less like sparring. I noticed I made eye contact more, not because I felt confident, but because I wasn't bracing for judgment in the same way. Other things were harder. Every time someone used the new name, I felt a split. One part of me softened, one part of me flinched. When I signed documents at work, my hand hesitated. When I met friends for drinks, I watched myself laugh and wondered if the laugh was mine or borrowed. At night I plugged in the USB and read through the archived notes, not just the data but the narrative. The organization, yes, it was an organization, layered under harmless consulting names, had a mission statement full of words like resilience, social integration, harm reduction. They justified the rewrites as a way to protect people from discrimination by adjusting their lives into versions that would be safer, more accepted, more aligned. Aligned. The word made my stomach twist because alignment can mean honesty, and it can also mean compliance. I found a list of subjects. Dozens. Some had been rewritten into different careers, different cities, different family structures. Some had been rewritten into different presentations, different gender markers, different social roles. Not all were cross-dressing related. This wasn't about clothing. It was about controllability. About how identity can be nudged, packaged, sold as intervention. And then I found the note that finally broke my denial. Subject exhibited persistent identity dissonance paired with high social compliance. Recommended for full narrative overlay under Identity Track G. My life had been categorized like a file in a cabinet. I didn't sleep much after that. Lack of sleep makes your mind fragile, and mine was already strained. I started having moments in the day where I'd lose time, seconds, minutes, standing in the kitchen holding a spoon, not sure what I'd been about to do. I began to understand what the facilitator had meant about the overlay stabilizing. My mind, desperate for coherence, was trying to choose one story. That frightened me more than anything else. Because it meant if I didn't act, I might wake up one day and not remember that there had ever been an old name. I might lose the ability to even ask the question of who I was. I called my sister again. We met at a park, away from my apartment, away from devices. I watched her walk toward me, her familiar gait, her hair pulled back the way she always did when she was trying to look casual but was actually worried. She sat beside me on the bench and said, "Okay. You're scaring me now. What's going on?" I told her the truth, or as much as I could without sounding like a person who'd escaped from an institution. I told her that my records had changed, that the world insisted I was someone else, that I'd found evidence of deliberate manipulation. She listened with an expression that didn't mock me. My sister has always had the rare skill of taking people seriously without automatically agreeing with them. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Finally she said, "You realize how impossible this sounds." "I know," I whispered. "But," she continued, "I also know you. And you're not dramatic. You don't invent stories for attention. So either something is happening to you, or something happened to you. Either way, you need help. Real help." I swallowed. I can't go to a doctor and say my life has been rewritten. They'll assume psychosis. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe you go to a therapist and you say, I'm having identity confusion, memory gaps, intense stress. Those are true statements. You don't have to lead with the most unbelievable part." I looked at her. "And what about the gender stuff?" She shrugged gently. "Then you tell them that too. Not as a shameful confession. As a part of you that you've been carrying alone." The simplicity of her words made my eyes burn. Carrying alone. That was exactly it. "I don't know what I am," I said. "I don't know what this means." "You don't have to decide what you are today," she replied. "You just have to stop punishing yourself for asking." I stared at my hands. The skin around my nails looked raw from picking. My body was telling on me. She nudged my shoulder. "Also," she added, softer, "I remember you once, when you were maybe 12, you asked me if it was possible to be more than one thing. Like, you didn't use those words. But you asked. And I said yes. And you looked relieved for a second, then scared, like relief was dangerous." I felt a tightness in my throat. "I don't remember that." "I do," she said. "That's why I'm telling you. If you're worried your memory is being messed with, borrow mine for a while. Borrow mine." The sentence settled inside me like warmth. That afternoon, I booked a therapy appointment. I chose someone with experience in identity exploration and anxiety. I didn't tell myself it was proof of anything. I told myself it was a form of self-respect. If my mind was under strain, I deserved support. Therapy didn't solve the mystery. It did something more important. It gave me a place where I didn't have to perform certainty. My therapist didn't demand a label. She didn't treat crossdressing as a joke or a scandal. She treated it as one possible language my mind had been using to express a deeper truth, that I'd been constrained, that I'd been lonely, that I'd been taught to fear my own softness. She also treated the memory gaps seriously. She asked about sleep, stress, dissociation. She encouraged grounding techniques that were practical and unglamorous, keeping a written daily log, eating regular meals, limiting caffeine, walking, checking in with safe people. She emphasized that mystery doesn't excuse neglect. If I wanted to find the truth, I had to keep my body and mind stable enough to pursue it. Meanwhile, the organization didn't disappear. I noticed subtle signs that I was being watched. A car parked near my building more than once. A new consultant at work asking friendly questions about my routine. Emails that seemed to anticipate decisions I hadn't made yet. One evening, the facilitator texted me from an unknown number, "If you want your past, you need leverage. Meet me." I didn't want to meet her. I also knew she was right. We met in a crowded coffee shop, the kind where anonymity comes from noise. She looked different out in public, less like an authority figure and more like a tired woman who'd been holding too many secrets. She slid into the seat across from me and said, "You're doing therapy. Good. You're monitoring me," I said. "Not me," she replied. "Others. I'm trying to keep you ahead of them." I clenched my jaw. "Why should I believe you?" "Because if I wanted you contained, I wouldn't have given you the file," she said. "I'd have waited until the overlay stabilized and you stopped asking questions." I stared at her cup. "What do you want from me?" She pulled a small envelope from her bag and slid it across the table. Inside is access to a server archive. Not the public-facing one. The real one. Evidence. Names. The kind of thing that can bring this down. My heart pounded. "And what's the price?" She met my eyes. "You have to decide what you're going to do with your own life first. Because once you go public, they'll retaliate. They'll attack your credibility. They'll frame you as unstable. If you can't hold your own narrative with both hands, they'll take it from you." I felt anger flare. "You did take it." She didn't flinch. "Yes. And I'm telling you why it worked, because you were already letting other people write you. I'm not saying that to blame you. I'm saying it because you need to build something inside yourself they can't edit." The words hit a place in me that therapy had already begun to tenderize. A place that understood how often I'd apologized for taking up space, how often I'd shaped myself to fit what others expected. The organization hadn't created that pattern. They'd exploited it. "What if I don't want the new identity?" I asked. "What if I want my old name back?" She nodded. "Then you can fight for it. But you have to be honest about why. Is it because it's true? Or because it's safe? Because those aren't always the same." I hated that she could ask that question. I hated that it mattered. She leaned closer. "There's another option," she said. Integration. Not choosing one narrative and erasing the other, but owning the fact that you've been more than one thing. Legally, socially, internally. It will be messy. People don't like messy. But messy is harder to control. I stared at the envelope. "You want me to become a problem." "I want you to become a person," she said quietly. I left the coffee shop with the envelope in my pocket, feeling the weight of it like a second heart. That night I sat at my kitchen table and wrote 2 columns on a piece of paper. Old name. New name. Under each, I wrote what I associated with them. Not what the world expected, but what I felt. Under the old name I wrote, safety, numbness, compliance, invisibility, pride and endurance, fear of being found out. Under the new name I wrote, risk, presence, softness, honesty, grief, possibility, anger at being manipulated. I stared at the list until the lines blurred. Then I wrote a third column, me. Under me I wrote, responsibility, kindness, stubbornness, curiosity, shame, hope. It was the first time I'd put hope next to my own name without feeling ridiculous. The next weeks were the hardest of my life, not because of chase scenes or dramatic confrontations, but because of quiet, relentless choices. I started telling a few trusted friends that something was wrong. Not the full conspiracy, but the truth that I was struggling with my identity, with memory, with stress. I watched their faces for disgust or mockery. Mostly I saw concern. Some were awkward. Some said the wrong thing. But none of them turned me into a spectacle. The shame I'd carried had been predicting cruelty that wasn't always there. I also started practicing being visible on purpose. That sounds small, but it was terrifying. It meant wearing what felt right to me without treating it as a secret test. It meant letting my voice be gentle without quickly hardening it. It meant admitting when I didn't know something, instead of pretending competence to avoid scrutiny. It meant accepting care. Not everyone reacted well. A coworker made a joke that landed like a slap. An old friend grew distant, not out of hatred but discomfort. My father, when I visited, looked at me for a long time and said, "You look different." The word different carried his old warning inside it. I surprised myself by answering calmly.
Yeah.
I am. He didn't yell. He didn't forbid. He just looked away, and the sadness in that moment was sharp but clean. It was the sadness of realizing that my parents' limitations were real, and that loving them didn't mean shrinking myself to fit them. I kept going to therapy. I kept writing daily logs. I kept sleeping as best I could, eating as best I could, walking when anxiety made my skin feel too tight. These weren't dramatic acts. They were the opposite. They were the slow work of building a self that could hold stress without collapsing into self-erasure. And then I opened the envelope. The server archive was real. It contained recordings, internal memos, consent forms that weren't consent at all, just legal fog. It contained evidence that the organization targeted people at vulnerable points, after breakups, after job losses, after family crises. Times when identity feels thin, when you're more likely to accept a new story because the old one hurts. It also contained something that made me sit back in my chair, cold, a memo about me. Subject demonstrates high capacity for narrative adoption if provided with supportive social feedback loops. Recommend reinforcing through family confirmation and workplace stability. My family. My workplace. They'd been used as tools. I felt rage that was clean and fierce. Not the performative rage of social media, not the rage that demands applause. The rage of realizing someone had treated my life like a chessboard. I called the facilitator. "I want to expose this," I said. She exhaled. "Then we do it carefully." Carefully meant legal counsel, journalists who understood ethics, advocates who cared more about harm reduction than headlines. It meant not throwing chaos into the world and calling it justice. It meant thinking about the other subjects, about how public exposure could endanger them if their identities were already unstable. It meant choosing responsibility even when I wanted revenge. It also meant something deeply personal, deciding how I would speak about myself in the process. If I framed this as, "They forced me to crossdress," it would feed the worst stereotypes and invite the wrong kind of attention. It would reduce me to a gimmick. It would make my identity exploration sound like a punishment. That wouldn't be true, and it would harm others who explore presentation in healthy ways. So I chose a more honest frame, even though it was harder. They manipulated my life by exploiting the parts of me I'd been afraid to admit, and in doing so they revealed how much I'd been living under other people's expectations long before they touched me. When the story finally broke, months later, after evidence was verified and names were confirmed, I watched the public reaction with a kind of numb grief. Some people were outraged. Some dismissed it as impossible. Some treated it like entertainment, which is what people do when they don't know how to sit with real human harm. The organization denied everything, then pivoted to good intentions, then blamed a few rogue actors. Classic. There were investigations. There were lawsuits. There were people who lost jobs. There were also people who came forward quietly, telling stories that sounded like mine in different keys, waking up to a life that didn't fit, realizing their own doubts had been used against them, trying to stitch themselves back together. Through all of it, the most difficult part wasn't the external fight. It was the internal one, deciding whether I wanted to revert my legal identity to the old name, the old marker, the old consensus. I had the option now. The evidence gave me leverage. The facilitator, no, the woman, because I stopped letting her role define her, helped arrange the process. It could be done. I sat with the decision for a long time. Because the question wasn't just which name felt familiar. It was which life I wanted to be responsible for. In therapy, I said something one day that surprised me as I spoke it. I said, "I'm scared that if I go back, I'll go back to disappearing." My therapist nodded and said, "And if you stay?" "I'm scared that if I stay, I'll be proving they can rewrite me." She leaned forward. "What if neither is true? What if you're not proving anything except that you're choosing consciously now?" Consciously. That was the word. I realized then that my deepest fear wasn't about gender or clothing. It was about agency. About whether I was allowed to author myself. I decided to integrate. Legally, I reclaimed parts of my old identity, so my original name returned as part of my official documentation, not as a footnote, but as a lived truth. I also kept elements of the new identity that felt like growth rather than coercion, the way I presented myself in certain settings, the way I allowed softness, the way I stopped apologizing for existing. I told people the truth in the simplest way I could, that my records had been manipulated, that I was reclaiming my history, that I was also learning to live more honestly than I had before. Some people struggled. Some made it about them. Some needed time. A few couldn't come with me. That hurt, but it was real hurt, not the self-inflicted hurt of pretending I didn't care. My father and I had the hardest conversation of our lives at my parents' kitchen table. I didn't accuse him. I didn't demand an apology for the scarf moment, though part of me wanted to. I told him, calmly, that I had spent years afraid of being seen, and that I couldn't live that way anymore. I told him that exploring presentation had helped me understand myself, not in a sensational way, but in a human way, learning what felt authentic, learning what I'd been repressing, learning how much of my strength had been avoidance. He listened with a stiffness that used to terrify me. Then he said something small, almost inaudible. I didn't know. I wanted to scream, of course you didn't know, you trained me to hide. But I also knew he was telling the truth. He hadn't known because he couldn't imagine a world where those feelings could exist without being dangerous. My mother cried quietly and said, I just want you safe. I do too, I told her. But safety can't be the same as shrinking. Over time, my parents didn't become perfect. They became a little more open. They asked awkward questions. They made mistakes. I learned to set boundaries without cruelty. I learned that reconciliation isn't a single moment, it's a series of choices to keep showing up. At work, I advocated for privacy protections and identity verification safeguards, not as a crusade but as a practical response to what had happened. I learned how institutions can be manipulated, and I learned how to push back without turning my life into an endless fight. I found purpose in the unglamorous work of policy and empathy, helping others understand that identity isn't just a label, it's a lived experience held together by community, and that community has ethical responsibilities. And in my personal life, I continued exploring presentation in a way that was grounded and non-performative. Some days that meant dressing in ways that aligned with traditional masculinity because that's what felt right. Other days it meant choosing clothes that leaned feminine because that's what felt honest. The point stopped being to prove anything. The point became to listen to myself without panic. I also learned to talk about crossdressing without shame and without spectacle. I learned to say, this helped me understand how much I'd been policing myself. I learned to say, clothing isn't morality. I learned to say, you don't have to understand someone perfectly to treat them with respect. I learned to say, exploration doesn't make you less worthy, it can make you more present. There were still difficult nights. There were still moments when I'd see an old photo and feel grief for the person who had been trying so hard to be allowed. There were moments when I'd look at the newer photos and feel angered that they existed because of coercion. Integration didn't erase those feelings. It gave them a place to live where they didn't have to control me. If you take anything from my story, I hope it's this: identity isn't a single reveal or a dramatic transformation. For many of us, it's a long negotiation between what we feel, what we've been taught, and what the world will permit. When someone manipulates that negotiation, whether it's a parent with 3 words, a peer group with ridicule, an institution with paperwork, or an organization with an agenda, the harm isn't just the change itself. The harm is the theft of choice. But choice can be rebuilt. It can be practiced like a muscle. You can learn to ask yourself, gently and repeatedly, what do I actually feel? What am I afraid of? Who benefits when I stay silent? What would self-respect look like today? And you can do that work without hurting others, without turning your life into a battle, without turning your body into a billboard for someone else's comfort or outrage. You can do it with patience. With support. With professional help when you need it. with empathy for yourself and for the people around you who are still learning. I don't think I'll ever fully understand why I was chosen, except that I fit their map, compliant, lonely in my own skin, trained to accept the story handed to me. The deeper lesson is that none of us should be easy to rewrite. Not because we should be rigid, but because we should be rooted. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.